Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello students, welcome back with Miss Kanaya and
Miss Salsa, how have you been all? I hope all of you are fine.
before we start the lesson, let's pray together. Pray start and pray end.
Now, I want to make sure whether all of you are happy with me or not. May I know how many of you are in this class?
Do students here like watching fantasy story? If you all like it, please let me know.
Assume you are all in a fantasy world, right? What fantasy story do you want?
There are several materials that will be discussed today. Namely, number 1, understanding fantasy. Number 2, fantasy goals. And number 3, types of fantasy. Number 4, characteristic of fantasy. And number 5, structure of fantasy.
Do you know what is fantasy? And what about the characteristic of fantasy? Do you all know it?
So, you all don't know what fantasy is? Okay students, we will to explain about fantasy. Fantasy has a couple of meanings. Number 1, imagination. This is the general sense, referring to the use of your imagination to create worlds, characters, or situations that are not real. It can be used for pleasant daydreams or for more creative endeavors like writing stories. Number 2, genre of fiction. This refers to stories set in imaginary worlds, often featuring magic, supernatural creatures, and fantastical settings. For example, is Think Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter.
There are also some goals about fantasy, such as 1. Entertainment. Fantasy stories can be thrilling, funny, scary, or romantic, offering a fine escape from reality. 2. Exploration. Fantasy allows you to explore different ideas and ways of living. 3. Wish fulfillment. We can imagine ourselves as heroes or live in a world where our desires come true. 4. Social commentary. Fantasy stories can use fantastical elements to comment on real-world issues.
Next, types of fantasy story. Fantasy stories are divided into 2 types, namely those based on real-life settings and story settings. So, what is the difference? Number 1, based on real-life suitability. Fantasy story texts that are based on real-life matches are divided into 2, namely A. Total fantasy story. In this type, all these stories, characters, settings, even all the elements in them are fantasy or do not happen in real life. For example, is a story about the life of a kingdom under the sea. Slice fantasy story. Slice fantasy stories use a fantasy world setting where the names of places or events still exist in the real world. For example, is a story about the life of Snow White and the 7 dwarfs in the middle of the forest. Number 2, based on the story setting. This type of fantasy story is also divided into 2, namely A. Contemporary fantasy stories. Contemporary fantasy stories only use a one-time setting gang. For example, use the present, past, or future time setting. B. Fantasy story across time. Fantasy stories across time are the opposite of contemporary fantasy stories. In the story, the code has 2 different time settings. For example, the author used past and present time settings in one series of stories.
Next, these elements can also be said to be characteristic that different fantasy story texts from other types of texts. 1. There is magic, strangeness, and mystery. 2. Story idea. 3. Using various settings or across space and time. 4. Has supernatural power. 5. It is fictional. 6. Language.
In general, the structure of a fantasy story text consists of 4 parts, namely, number 1, orientation, number 2, complication, number 3, resolution, and the last, ending.
If you all don't understand about fantasy shall we have an example of an animated fantasy story video?
Snow White's Story. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess named Snow White. She was kind and gentle and a friend to all animals. One day, Snow White met a charming prince. As they sang a song of love together, Snow White's evil stepmother, the queen, watched them. The queen was so jealous of Snow White's beauty that she ordered her huntsman to kill the young princess. But the huntsman couldn't bring himself to hurt Snow White. He told her to run far away so the queen would never find her. Snow White ran deep into the woods. She was lost and scared, but soon found herself in front of a cottage. The princess knocked, but no one was home. She slowly stepped inside. The cottage was a mess. With the help of her forest friends, Snow White cleaned every nook and cranny. "Maybe whoever lives here will let me stay," said Snow White. Upstairs, Snow White found 7 little beds. She thought they belonged to children. Tired from cleaning, Snow White yawned as she curled up on the beds and fell asleep. Meanwhile, the 7 dwarfs were heading home from a long day of working in a jewel mine. They were anxious to get home to their cottage in the woods. The 7 dwarfs were surprised when they found a princess inside their home. When Snow White awoke, she was charmed by the 7 dwarfs: Dopey, Sneezy, Happy, Grumpy, Doc, Bashful, and Sleepy. The dwarfs wanted to protect the beautiful princess from the evil queen, so they invited Snow White to live with them. To celebrate, the new friends sang and danced the night away. Back at the castle, the queen learned that Snow White was still alive. Enraged, she made a magic potion to change her appearance. Her plan was to trick the princess. After the dwarfs had set off for work the next day, the queen, disguised as an old peddler woman, offered Snow White a beautiful red apple. Snow White took one bite of the apple and fell into a deep sleep. The queen had poisoned her. When the dwarfs came home, they chased the queen to the top of a stormy mountain. Suddenly, lightning hit the mountain, and the queen fell, never to be seen again. But Snow White was still in a deep sleep. The 7 dwarfs kept watch over her day and night. Finally, Snow White's Prince Charming arrived. He had been searching everywhere for the beautiful princess he had sung with so long ago. The prince awakened Snow White with love's first kiss. The spell was broken. Snow White and the prince returned to the kingdom and lived happily ever after. The end.
Alright students, thank you for today. I hope you're always happy. Take care of yourself. Have a nice day, students. See you all.